Boy keeps making strange hand signals during flight. When stewardess realizes why, she orders the plane to land. Now he was doing it again. This can't be a coincidence, Carole thought while looking at the boy walking into the plane. There was something about him, something that gave her a bad feeling. A really bad feeling. It took her back right to that one day. That day she had so desperately wished to forget. That day had changed her life forever, and not in a good way. She had decided to forget about it, to just leave it behind and go on living her life like everything was fine. But now, this boy stepped into her plane. At first, she hadn't really noticed him. She was busy doing her duties as a flight attendant. She had a lot of things to do on her checklist once the passengers boarded the plane, so her mind was occupied with that. But it didn't take long before her mind was occupied with something entirely different. From the minute the boy stepped onto the plane, Carole had an odd feeling about him. She couldn't quite figure out what it was, but something about him told her to pay close attention. What is it? What are you trying to tell me? Carole thought, pensive. She bit her lip and squinted her eyes to take a better look at him. As the boy moved down the aisle, Carole's instincts urged her to observe every detail. He seemed young, probably no more than 12 years old. He had a nervous energy around him that was almost palpable. His eyes darted around the cabin, never settling in one place for too long, as if he was worried someone might be watching him. He specifically seemed to avoid looking at the woman at his side. His hands were fidgety, constantly adjusting the strap of the backpack slung over his shoulder, or running through his disheveled hair. Despite the plane's comfortable ambience, he wore a jacket much too large for his slight frame, making him appear even smaller, almost swallowed by the fabric. Even his walk was hesitant, each step taken with a cautiousness that was unusual for someone his age. Carole couldn't ignore the alarm bells ringing in her head. Why does he seem so out of place? She wondered, her gaze following him as he finally chose a seat. The way he glanced around before sitting down. The slight tremble as he stowed his backpack under the seat in front of him. Every little action screamed that something was off. She was so caught up in her own thoughts that she hadn't even noticed her colleague, Terry, sneaking up on her. "What's up?" Terry said cheerfully. Carole gasped. "Oh, you startled me," she said, putting on a fake smile. "I was just daydreaming for a bit," she explained, keeping the mood light. She didn't want to tell her what was on her mind. What if she was wrong? Terry took her in for a moment and then asked, "Ready to start serving drinks?" Carole nodded, and they both headed towards the galley. Carole desperately hoped she could serve in aisle 2. She had a specific reason for wanting to work in aisle 2. It was where the young boy, who had caught her attention earlier, was sitting. She hoped to get closer to maybe understand a little more about him. "Can we take aisle 2? She asked Terry, hoping it might help her figure out that odd feeling she had earlier. But it seemed luck wasn't on her side. "Looks like Joanne and Steve already started there," Terry replied with a frown. "Why aisle 2? She wondered, curious. "Did you spot a cute guy sitting there?" With a mischievous grin, she glanced quickly at Carole and then turned her attention to aisle 2, trying to spot the guy she guessed Carole had noticed. "Oh no, that's not it at all," Carole quickly interjected, trying to downplay her interest. "It's really nothing." Yet, Terry wasn't convinced and continued to give Carole that all-too-knowing look, her smile suggesting she saw right through the facade. Feeling the pressure to deflect further inquiry, Carole adopted her most convincing tone and said, "It's actually because of my lucky number, you know. Number 2. That's the whole reason." Terry paused, her response drawn out and playful. Well, all right, if that's how you want to play it. Fine." She continued with a hint of jest, "There's no harm in looking, you know. I spot handsome men all the time, and I would definitely share that eye candy with my colleague. But whatever," she sighed, pretending to give up on the matter. Yet her tone suggested a blend of amusement and mock resignation. Carole decided to ignore her and closely observed the interactions between the boy and the woman seated next to him. As the woman ordered a glass of wine for herself and an apple juice for the boy, it became apparent to Carole that they were traveling together. However, the boy's demeanor, his scared and uncertain expression, did not escape Carole's keen observation. Even though everything seemed normal on the surface, Carole couldn't ignore her gut feeling that something was wrong. She really wanted to step in and help the boy, who clearly felt very uncomfortable in the situation. Since they were on a long 13-hour flight, Carole had plenty of time to act, but she needed to do so carefully and quietly. Carole planned to approach the boy right after she was done serving drinks. She thought of a good excuse ahead of time, just in case her colleagues got curious about what she was doing. She decided she'd wait for the perfect moment when the woman accompanying the boy went to the restroom so she could talk to the boy privately. As Carole kept an eye on the boy and the woman next to him, her patience was wearing thin. She was on high alert, waiting for just the right moment when the woman would get up, perhaps to stretch her legs or use the restroom. That would be her chance to step in and check on the boy. She couldn't help but notice the boy's hands. They were busy, constantly moving in a way that seemed out of place. He wasn't just fiddling with the hem of his shirt or tapping his fingers aimlessly. It looked almost like he was trying to tell her something. Is he signaling me? Carole wondered, her curiosity piqued. Her thoughts raced as she planned what to say to him, how to appear friendly and not scare him off. Maybe a joke about the food, or a comment about how long the flight is, she thought, trying to come up with the perfect icebreaker. The cabin's steady hum of noise, from the chatter of passengers to the occasional ding of a call button, filled the background. Yet Carole barely noticed. Her focus was entirely on the boy and the woman seated next to him. Who was she to him? And what was making him so nervous? Every time the woman took a sip of her wine, Carole watched closely, hoping she would decide to get up. The smell of coffee drifted from the galley, mingling with the recycled air, reminding Carole of the long hours ahead on this flight. She made mental notes of the boy's actions, the way he looked out the window, then quickly glanced around the cabin, and the nervous tap of his foot. These small details stood out to Carole, signaling that all was not well. As she pushed the drink cart down the aisle, she kept stealing glances at the boy, trying to catch his eye and offer a reassuring smile. She was ready to act, to offer help or just a listening ear, as soon as she saw an opening. Her resolve was clear, backed by a mix of concern and a dash of hope that she could make a difference. After waiting for almost 2 hours, Carole finally saw her opportunity when the woman went to the bathroom. Seizing the chance, Carole concocted a quick excuse to approach the boy. She turned to her colleague. Hey, can you cover for me for a sec? I saw the boy drop his coloring book. I'm just going to hand it back to him, okay? Her colleague nodded, oblivious to Carole's underlying motive. And Carole took that as her green light to discreetly check on the boy. Taking a calming breath, Carole quietly picked up a coloring book from the plain stash, making her way to the boy with a casual demeanor. It was then she truly noticed what had caught her attention earlier. The boy was engaged in peculiar hand gestures, exactly like she saw him do earlier, just as they boarded the plane and the woman was preoccupied with storing their luggage in the overhead bins. Now, he was repeating these gestures. It appeared as though he was attempting to communicate something through his hand movements. The moment the boy noticed Carole approaching, his eyes widened in surprise, and he quickly diverted his gaze back to the window. Hi there, Carole started, trying to sound friendly. I've brought you a nice coloring book, if you're interested. But the boy didn't react at all. He didn't even glance at Carole's way, knowing she didn't have much time. Carole quickly put the coloring book and pencils on the boy's tray table. If you need anything at all, just wave, okay? I'll be right at the back, she offered softly, aiming to instill a sense of safety and warmth. Her eyes lingered on him, searching for any hint of response or comfort in his reaction. Yet, as she hoped to bridge the gap, Carole spotted something moving out of the corner of her eye. It was the woman. She was returning to her seat, and instantly, her eyes landed on the coloring books now positioned in front of the boy. Her brow furrowed in a frown, and she looked at them closely, trying to figure out what was going on. She looked from the coloring books to the boy, and then her eyes landed on Carole, standing not too far away. Carole let out a sigh, realizing her plan hadn't worked. She had hoped the coloring book would help gain the boy's trust, but he hadn't even acknowledged her presence. Now, this woman was staring at her as if she had done something wrong when all she wanted was to help. Carole suddenly felt really uncomfortable under the piercing gaze of this woman. She needed to get out of there. Carole mustered up a quick, just thought he might enjoy the coloring books, with a nervous smile towards the woman. Without waiting for a response, she retreated back to the crew area, her heart racing. From her new vantage point, she continued to observe the boy and the woman, ensuring she maintained a safe distance to avoid arousing further suspicion. Despite the setback, Carole's attention didn't waver. She noted how the boy resumed his mysterious hand gestures, whenever the woman's attention was elsewhere, engrossed in a book or gazing out the window. These movements weren't random, they were deliberate, almost like a silent language only he spoke. Is he trying to tell me something? Carole wondered, her instincts telling her there was more to these signals than met the eye. The more she watched, the more convinced she became that these gestures were a form of communication, possibly a cry for help. Determined to understand, Carole leaned on her intuition, piecing together the silent messages the boy was desperately trying to convey. Each time the woman looked away, his small hands moved with urgency, telling a story Carole was just beginning to unravel. And then, suddenly, it clicked. "Oh no," Carole whispered to herself, a wave of realization washing over her. "This can't be happening." Suddenly, she understood why she'd felt an instant unease about the boy, even without knowing the full story. It reminded her too much of a dark day she thought she had left behind, and it was all connected to the silent language of his hands. That moment of recognition took Carole back to a chapter in her own life she'd tried so hard to close, a time when she, too, was a little kid, making similar hand signals in a crowded room, silently pleading for someone to notice, to understand her silent cries for help. But back then, no one did. She had seen it during a show on television, and it had stuck with her. Carole stared at her hands and held her thumb tucked into her palm, her fingers folding over it, symbolically trapping her thumb. She still remembered it, and she had remembered it the day she first saw it on television. It was the signal for help. She knew then she would need it one day, and indeed, she did. Unfortunately, when she came to the point where she needed to use it, no one else noticed. Or perhaps they didn't want to notice. Carole closed her eyes, thinking back on it. The memory was a shadow, always lurking, a reminder of her vow made in the solitude of her own heart. She had promised herself that if she ever saw those silent pleas again, she would act differently. She would be the help she never received. Now, standing in the aisle of the plane, that promise echoed loudly in her mind. The boy's gestures, so like her own from years ago, reignited a determination within Carole. This time, she wouldn't just watch. This time, she would do everything within her power to understand and help, because she knew all too well the despair of being unseen, of signals lost in the noise of the world around her, and she refused to let history repeat itself on her watch. But where could she start? What could she do? And would anyone believe her? Carole stared at the boy, trying to think of the best way to handle the situation. "What's going on, Carole?" a colleague suddenly asked. It was almost as if she could read Carole's thoughts. "You seem a bit off today," she observed, catching Carole by surprise. With a heavy sigh, Carole admitted, "There's something I need to share." She then poured out her concerns to Joanne, her colleague, detailing everything from the unusual hand signs the boy was making, to his frightened and confused demeanor, especially when the woman was not around, and even her own story from when she was young and no one noticed her signal for help. After Carole finished explaining, Joanne sighed and said, "This all sounds very odd. Why not just ask the woman directly?" Carole looked down, realizing she hadn't considered that option. Her imagination had immediately turned to detective work, likely influenced by her own story. But she'd probably just deny anything was wrong. Carole murmured to Joanne after a moment of thought. Joanne's nod was slow but certain. "Yeah, that makes sense." Joanne paused, her expression showing a mix of concern and uncertainty. "Let's just watch them for a while, all right?" she suggested cautiously. "We need to be sure before we do anything. Let's not do anything rash or, stupid." Carole felt a twinge of frustration but knew Joanne had a point. The last thing they needed was to escalate the situation without being absolutely sure. "Okay," Carole agreed reluctantly, "watching and waiting it is. But I'm telling you, there's something off here." Advertisement. Joanne gave her a sympathetic look. "I believe you, Carole, but we have to play this smart. We can keep an eye on them. And if things seem to get worse or if we notice anything else suspicious, we'll figure out our next step then." After formulating their plan, Carole and Joanne resumed their duties with heightened vigilance. Carole's heart throbbed with the yearning to assist, yet she understood the necessity of patience. She resolved to wait, observe, and spring into action when the moment presented itself. Little did she realize that moment would arrive sooner than expected. Suddenly, the quiet of the flight was broken by the boy's loud scream. It cut through the noise of the engine and the quiet talking of passengers. Carole caught Joanne's eye. In that brief moment, Joanne nodded, her expression shifting from skepticism to belief. It was as if the boy's scream had erased any doubt she harbored about Carole's concerns. "See, I told you something wasn't right," Carole said quickly, her voice low but urgent. Joanne, now fully on board, replied just as swiftly, "I get it now. Let's go help him." There was no time for a lengthy discussion. Their priority was clear. Carole and Joanne didn't hesitate. They rushed over to see what was happening, their earlier worries now seeming very real. They found the boy trying hard to get away from the woman holding him. "Let him go," Carole shouted, her voice strong and clear in the busy cabin. The woman, taken aback, locked eyes with Carole, surprise etching her features. "He's just frightened by the engine's roar," she attempted to explain, her voice a mix of defensiveness and concern. Yet, Carole's instincts screamed otherwise. The woman's words just didn't sit right with her. Without hesitation, she turned around, her steps quick and silent as she made her way back to the galley. There, with a steady hand, she dialed the airport's emergency number, her mind racing as she reported their imminent arrival and the uneasy situation unfolding on board. Carole spoke with urgency into the phone. "You need to be at the gate ready to board as soon as we land. I can't let that woman leave the plane with the boy." Her voice carried a resolve born of deep concern. Hanging up, she turned to Joanne, sharing a look that said it all. "We're doing the right thing," Joanne reassured her, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. Carole nodded, feeling the weight of their decision but fortified by the belief that they were preventing a potential mishap. The plane's descent became a countdown to the moment of truth, each second ticking by with heightened anticipation. As the plane descended, Carole's mind raced with a mixture of anxiety and determination. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was of the essence, that they needed to act swiftly to ensure the safety of the boy. Glancing out of the window, she watched as the ground approached rapidly, the lights of the city below becoming clearer with each passing moment. The intercom crackled to life as the pilot announced their imminent landing, instructing passengers to fasten their seatbelts and prepare for arrival. Carole's heart pounded in her chest as she exchanged a determined look with Joanne. They were committed to seeing this through, to ensuring that the boy received the help he needed. As their flight neared its destination, Carole moved through the cabin with a sense of purpose, her movements brisk and determined. "Stay sharp and stick with me," she directed her colleagues, masking her urgency with the routine of pre-landing checks. Their nods were quick, understanding the unspoken gravity behind her words. The moment the aircraft's wheels kissed the runway, a collective sigh of relief whispered through the cabin. Yet, Carole's voice, firm and authoritative, punctuated the calm. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened," she announced, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. It was a standard instruction, yet it carried into weight, echoing her resolve to ensure the boy's safety until they were securely on the ground. As the aircraft door swung open, a trio of police officers entered, their presence immediately altering the atmosphere. The faint murmur of conversations died down as the officers stepped inside, their heavy boots thudding softly against the floor. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as each officer moved with purpose, their badges glinting in the dim light of the plane. A hush fell over the passengers as they watched the officers navigate the narrow aisle. With practiced ease, the air was charged with anticipation, every eye trained on the unfolding scene before them. Whispers of speculation rippled through the cabin, mingling with the low hum of the engines outside. The officers approached the boy and his guardian, their expressions unreadable. The woman's eyes widened in surprise as they came to a stop in front of her, their authoritative presence casting a shadow over the cramped space. "Excuse me, ma'am," one of the officers spoke up, his voice carrying a blend of firmness and respect. "We need to speak with you and the young man." His words sliced through the tension, commanding the attention of every passenger within earshot. The woman's eyes widened in surprise as the officers halted before her, their presence looming large in the confined space. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, betraying her nervousness as she searched for answers. "Is something wrong?" she ventured, her voice tinged with uncertainty. The officer's gaze remained unwavering as he responded, "We'll need to discuss that outside the aircraft, ma'am." His tone brooked no argument, conveying a sense of urgency that left no room for doubt. Meanwhile, the boy remained silent, his gaze darting between the officers with a mixture of fear and confusion. An officer reached out, extending a reassuring hand towards him. After a moment's hesitation, the boy's hand found its way into the officer's, seeking comfort in the promise of safety. Amidst the commotion, the woman's voice rose in protest, laced with a blend of confusion and defiance. "He's with me. There's been a mistake," she insisted, her words echoing off the cabin walls. Carole and her crew exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier resolve now tinged with doubt. Was this the right course of action? Carole wondered, her gaze fixed on the unfolding scene with a mix of concern and determination. Undeterred by the intensity of the moment, the woman swiftly retrieved her identification from her purse, her fingers moving with practiced precision. With determination, she handed the documents over to one of the officers, her voice steady despite the underlying urgency. "I don't know what's going on," she began, her words laced with a hint of apprehension. But if it's about what happened earlier, I can explain. The officer, his features a mix of curiosity and suspicion, accepted the documents with a nod. As he scanned through them, his brow furrowed in concentration. Round him, the other passengers leaned in, their murmurs blending with the soft hum of the aircraft's engines. These hand signals, they're part of a therapy language we've developed, the woman explained, her voice clear and composed. She maintained her composure despite the weight of the situation. The officer's attention was drawn to a particular detail on the identification. His eyes widened slightly in surprise as he reviewed it more closely. With a thoughtful expression, he looked up at the woman and asked, "You're his aunt?" The woman nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, that's correct," she confirmed. "His mother couldn't make the trip, so I'm accompanying him instead." This revelation injected a new layer of complexity into the situation, leaving everyone present on edge, awaiting the next turn of events. "You see, he gets anxious, especially in places like this," the woman continued, her explanation unfolding a narrative far different from what Carole and her colleagues had initially imagined. The tension in Carole's chest eased slightly as she listened, realizing the complexity of the situation. How could she have misinterpreted it so drastically? With each detail shared by the aunt, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, revealing a story not of danger but of a child grappling with his emotions. The officers, captivated by the unfolding narrative, listened attentively as the boy, now calmer, spoke in soft tones, confirming his aunt's account. Relief washed over the cabin as empathy and understanding replaced the earlier tension. The officers' faces gradually softened, their initial suspicion giving way to understanding as the situation began to clarify. Carole, standing a short distance away, overheard the exchange and felt a mix of guilt wash over her. "Looks like we jumped to conclusions," she whispered to her colleague, regret coloring her voice. "Yeah, but our hearts were in the right place, Carole. We just wanted to help," her colleague responded, trying to offer some comfort amidst the confusion. But Carole couldn't just simply let it go. The realization that her well-meaning actions were rooted in a misunderstanding hit her like a wave. It was a stark reminder of the fine line between being vigilant and overly cautious, a line easily blurred by genuine concern. Carole couldn't shake off the weight of her mistake, despite the relief that now flooded the cabin. As the tension dissolved into understanding, she felt a pang of regret gnawing at her conscience. "I need to talk to them," she muttered to her colleague, her voice laced with determination. Joanne nodded in agreement, recognizing the need to set things right. As the police officers concluded their investigation and departed, Carole's heart raced with a mix of anxiety and determination. She cast a nervous glance in the direction of the woman and the boy, realizing it was her change to set things right. If she wanted to make up for her mistake, she had to speak to them before they left. With her colleagues preoccupied with helping people get off the plane, Carole seized her moment. She knew she had to act swiftly to make amends for her mistake before the woman and the boy left the plane. The weight of her decision hung heavy, urging her forward with urgency. Approaching them with measured steps, Carole began, "Excuse me." Her voice, gentle yet firm, caught their attention. The woman turned, surprise flickering across her face, while the boy regarded Carole with cautious interest. Taking a deep breath, Carole continued, "I owe you both an apology." Her sincerity echoed in her words as she confessed, "I let my own fears cloud my judgment. I misinterpreted your gestures, and for that, I am truly sorry." She paused, hoping for forgiveness despite her earlier misstep. The weight of her words hung in the air, a testament to her genuine remorse. The woman's response was one of understanding and empathy. "Thank you for your honesty," she replied warmly. "We understand how easily misunderstandings can arise, especially in situations like this." Encouraged by his aunt's reaction, the boy offered a shy smile in Carole's direction. Carole returned it, relieved to see the tension easing from his features. It was a small but significant step toward rebuilding trust. With a comforting embrace, the aunt soothed the boy's nerves, whispering reassurances that eased his tension. In this moment of tranquility, the air was charged with relief and goodwill. Expressing her gratitude, the aunt nodded graciously toward Carole. "Thank you for looking out for him," she said genuinely. "Even though it wasn't what you thought. I'm glad there are still people out there who act when they think they see danger." Watching the woman and the boy exit the plane, Carole couldn't help but feel a sense of relief mixed with lingering regret. Despite the resolution, she knew she had to learn from her mistake and strive to do better in the future. As the last of the passengers filed out, Carole found herself alone in the plane. the silence enveloping her in reflection. She replayed the events of the day in her mind, dissecting her actions and pondering the lessons learned. It was a humbling experience, one that reminded her of the importance of empathy, discernment, and humility in her role as a flight. Amidst the solitude of the empty cabin, Carole made a silent vow to herself, to always trust her instincts but to temper them with compassion and understanding. She knew that mistakes were inevitable, but it was how she chose to respond to them that truly mattered. With a newfound sense of purpose, Carole prepared to leave the plane, carrying with her the wisdom gained from the day's challenges. As she stepped onto solid ground, she faced the future with renewed determination, ready to navigate the complexities of her job with grace and integrity. Thinking about her future flights, Carole felt like she had a clearer perspective. She learned some important lessons from this incident that would guide her actions going forward. She understood that every passenger had their own story, reminding her to approach her job with empathy and flexibility.